Clicking button. Hi, welcome to another episode of the Massachusetts Pirate News. I'm joined today with Steve and Joe. Unfortunately, Malt couldn't make it. We do hope he's doing well. And so what news do we have today?
Hey, first we really are sorry that we weren't able to make it out for that mapping event today. It did break our hearts as well, but these things do happen.
That they do. I know I was looking forward to it and Malt was looking forward to it, but things unfortunately got in the way. We'll reschedule it, and hopefully it won't be too cold when we come back and finish that off. So
And
we have some news from someone being stopped by the state trooper.
it's an act of retaliation. So there was a gentleman who caught a trooper napping and decided to record him and make it pretty public, which, what other recourse do they have? But making it public knowledge that a trooper is just sitting there not doing their job. And now it seems that that trooper is really just trying to go after them, or the trooper and his cronies. And so this particular person has sensed that they've had a lot of extra slack upon them. So we will definitely link that story below, but it's just another case of those in power definitely abuse it.
Yeah,
And
that
there
was
could be,
funny because literally within minutes of the guy filming the police officer, he was pulled over by a different state trooper. I believe the charges. Well, they gave him a warning. He asked for them to give a citation, and not just a warning. And maybe I'm not getting those terms right, but but they just gave him a warning, and he's gone public about that because he didn't do anything wrong in filming a cop. It's not illegal to film cops in Massachusetts or any public official as long as they know you're recording them. So what
from what
else do we have?
from what I understand, just a little bit more about that. I apologize, but apparently it wasn't an isolated incident. I guess this guy saw this trooper napping in that location on a regular basis. It wasn't. It wasn't just something where he's like, "Oh, I saw him," and no, this was a regular thing. So, but that being said, um, I guess Steve, you had some stuff from on the security angle.
Yeah, so one of the things that sort of caught my attention going into the weekend was news about a security vulnerability in a you know in a free software logging package called Log4j. This is Log4j is almost it borders on being ubiquitous for use in Java applications, server side, website kind of stuff. Everybody and their uncle pretty much uses Log4j. So this vulnerability has been named Log4Shell. And the reason is it is a vulnerability that basically allows an attacker to execute remote code of their choice on your server if they can find kind of a way to connect the dots and hook everything together. So the vulnerability itself, it's kind of a variation on what we used to call printf style vulnerabilities, but it's worse. So printf is a like a C function for printing out formatted stuff. And the idea is that you have a formatting string which describes how the thing is supposed to look, and then you can plug in the bits and pieces to fill in kind of fill in the blanks, so to speak. Now, what you never want to do is give a person using your software the control over that format string, but user input, is usually okay to log as, tokens defined by the input string you provide. So with this vulnerability, Log4j had a facility for where you could kind of like do token expansion. Like if you said $, curly brace, os.user, close curly brace, it would, it would substitute a Java property and put in the username. Now the thing is, and we'll put a link to one of these JIRAs in there. I found a JIRA issue that's a good sort of illustration of, how this ended up working. But it seems that they allowed the token expansion to take place in, the user provided bits rather than just the format string itself, so that, a user could put in a token and then that would get expanded. So for just plain old text substitution, putting in a username or an operating system version, that's, maybe not so bad, but they also had facilities for basically downloading and running remote code, which means that if you like the one example that where they show, logging a user agent, if you changed your user agent to be the appropriate macro to download, make an LDAP call to a server that you control and download code that you wrote, then, it would the log4j would just happily download it and execute it, and I guess put the final value in the whatever string it returned, it would put that in the log entry. But the important part is, it basically allows an attacker to execute remote code of their choice on your server. So I gather this was a very busy week for a lot of system administrators. There are some mitigations and there is a patch that fixes a vulnerability, but it's just, it was an ouchie.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty serious. I mean, not only, as you said, is it an issue where it can compromise your system, but it can also, update the logs in such a way that you don't know you've been compromised. Whereas if there's some, if the output is we just hacked you, well, you'll find that in the logs if you pay attention to it. But, if it's just looks normal or just is empty text, then, you won't know.
Mm-hmm.
So update to log4j 2.15.0, that fixes the issue. And then I believe, Joe, we had one more issue.
Yeah, so there was a law that I just noticed being brought up, which was HD 4639. And let me just pull this up specifically. Do apologize.
And I just put it in the chat so you can look at it as we...
An act relative to the property tax exemption for affordable accessory dwelling until rental property in the city of Salem restricted as affordable housing. That's a whole lot of blah and legal jargon for tax codes specifically directed in the town of Salem, where I guess a better one who could explain this a little bit better, Steve, would you mind, seeing that your housing's more on point than mine?
I will take a stab at it. So first, I'll just preface this with a little bit of an explanation about accessory dwelling units. So an accessory dwelling unit is, they're kind of called like granny flats or in-law flats. But basically, if you have, what's normally considered a primary use, like a single family home, for example. So an accessory dwelling unit means that you can carve off a part of that. It's got its own kitchen, it's got its own bathroom, it's got its own entrance. And, it's basically a little in-law, a little apartment that you can rent out to, whomever you'd want. Some in the past, some of these have been used for like caretakers. Sometimes people will use them to age in place, or sometimes it's just for extra rental income. Now, at least in my experience with proposing ADU or working with ADU articles, and I know in my community, it's, we've tried several times to pass ADU legislation in previous years, and we were finally successful this past year. Is there's the usual hemming and hawing about, well, we don't want more people in our community. These people living in the ADUs are, will they change the character of our neighborhood? Will they commit crimes? Will they do this, that? It's basically a whole bunch of fear-mongering BS. Like, because it really, realistically, in Massachusetts, in Eastern Massachusetts, and all over the country, there is a housing shortage in metro areas. Housing prices are ridiculous. And one of the things that you absolutely have to do in order to address this is to build more of it. And, ideally, if you think that what you have is too expensive, you want to find ways to build smaller units that will be rented or sold at a lower price point. For ADUs, it's mostly rented at a lower price point. So Salem, Massachusetts passed a bylaw allowing ADUs. Actually, I think Salem is a city, so it would technically be an ordinance, but they would allow ADUs, but with the restriction that they wanted to restrict the amount of rent that could be charged for an occupant of the accessory dwelling units. So typically, this is one of my personal grumbles is, if you want people to build these things, try not to put too many restrictions on them. Building an ADU is not cheap. You could be looking at, $150,000 to do it properly into code. But they wanted Salem's restriction was that, they would limit the amount of rent you could charge. Now, this runs afoul of a law in Massachusetts called the Massachusetts Rent Control Prohibition Act. I forget which subchapter of Chapter 40 it is, but basically it was a law passed through voter referendum in, I think, 1995, that basically the state preempts any municipality from imposing local control. So how do you have an ADU ordinance where that involves rent control? It seems like Salem's strategy was to provide a tax abatement for, to reduce, your tax debt on that accessory dwelling unit. At any rate, this looks kind of like the state legislation that needs to happen, or, H 4639 looks like the state legislation that needs to happen in order to kind of make this all come together. But, I appreciate, I understand what Salem is, I think their intentions are good. I understand that sometimes it gets really messy making the legislative sausage, but, if they need this piece to make it work, they need this piece to make it work. But, I would have just said, for my druthers, I would have preferred to have seen accessory dwelling units allowed by right, as we did in Arlington, my community. Because they are smaller than like the single family home that they are attached to, they're inherently going to rent for less. And you kind of get your housing diversity and affordability that way.
I mean, it just seems like extra steps. Like a lot of extra steps.
Well, now I don't know how this played out particularly in Salem, but when people talk about affordable housing, in my experience, they have one of two goals in mind. One is to create housing that's relatively inexpensive and affordable to lower income individuals. And when this happens, people will talk your ear off about production and funding and where basically how the economics of it are supposed to work. Now, the other reason people talk about affordable housing is because by limiting the income for it, you're also creating an obstacle to getting it built. So if you think building market rate housing is easy, building affordable housing is a lot harder. So, sometimes when you hear the terms affordable housing, you have to think, is this actually about production, or is this an extra set of restrictions designed to discourage people from doing it? I don't know which of these is the case in Salem, but in my experience, it does go both ways.
Just again, we know that the massive projects can sometimes, when we do like what happened out in Chicago, those massive complexes tend to be more of a prison and a disaster. So I can kind of see them wanting to push lower income housing into like a smaller scale, but this just seems very loaded, in my
Well,
opinion.
I think one of the problems that you have with is that they're not mixed use, and there's once they build the building, then they underinvest in the area and it falls apart, and then people don't want to live there necessarily. So I think we can do good public housing. You've seen it in other parts of the world.
There's
This isn't a way to do it, I guess.
So just across the brook from me in Somerville, Massachusetts, the Somerville Housing Authority is planning to redevelop one of its properties. It's Clarendon Hill, and there's a website devoted to the project, clarendonhill.org. But they are actually going the route of taking some old properties that are they were built for GIs returning after World War II. So they're 75, 80 years old. They're what they describe as functionally obsolete, but basically they're building new apartments, expanding the number of low-income housing in the area, but also adding some market rate. So the market rate seems like a good, a good route in two ways. One is that by having a mix of incomes, you kind of avoid the concentration of poverty effect that you sometimes get in public housing. The other is that public housing authorities often have to stretch their dollar pretty far, and I would at least think that having some market rate in with the affordable just helps to get the financing to work a little more easily.
Yeah, from what I understood about the books and the way they're doing it for that particular project, they are doing a phenomenal job in integrating everything along with additional restaurants and restaurant space and office space and things of that nature.
Mm-hmm.
So again, going back to that key functionality piece that we were talking about, how that I know the Chicago example is an extreme one, but it's the one that always sticks in my mind whenever we talk about affordable housing and the pitfalls that that can happen.
Yeah. So I'm struggling to think of the name of the place, the name of the one you're thinking of. Pruitt-Igoe, which was in St. Louis, Missouri. It was also another, kind of a stark example of where the policy, and the project itself ultimately failed. But yeah, that's not to say that public housing is a bad thing. It serves a very important and useful purpose, but we do have, there are policy mistakes that we should try not to repeat.
And with that, definitely like, share, subscribe, comment below, and definitely check us out on masspirates.org.